An Outcast of the Islands. Part 1 by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 1. When he stepped off the straight and narrow path of his peculiar honesty, it was with an inward assertion of unflinching resolve to fall back again into the monotonous but safe stride of virtue as soon as his little excursion into the wayside quagmires had produced the desired effect. It was going to be a short episode, a sentence, in brackets, so to speak, in the Siepen des Bekomen Woord. Imagined that he could go on afterwards, looking at the sunshine, enjoying the shade, breathing in the perfume of flowers in the small garden before his house. He fancied that nothing would be changed, that he would be able as heretofore to tyrannize good-humoredly over his half-wife, to notice with tender contempt his yellow child depid boat. Those were the delights of his life, and he was unable to conceive that the moral significance of any act of his could interfere with the very nature of things, could dim the light of the sun, could destroy the perfume of the flowers, the submission of his wife, the smile of his child, the awe-struck respect of Leonard de Souza and of all the da Souza family. That family's admiration was the great luxury of his life. It rounded and completed his existence in a perpetual assurance of unquestionable superiority. He loved to breathe the coarse incense they offered before the shrine of the successful white man, the man that had done them the honor to marry their daughter, sister, cousin, the rising man sure to climb very high, the confidential clerk of Hudig & Co. They were a numerous and an unclean crowd, living in ruined bamboo houses, surrounded by neglected compounds on the outskirts of Macassar. He kept them at arm's length and even further off perhaps, having no illusions as to their worth. They were a half-caste, lazy lot, and he saw them as they were ragged, lean, unwashed, undersized men of various ages, shuffling about aimlessly in slippers, motionless old women who, looked like monstrous bags of pink calico stuffed with shapeless lumps of fat and deposited askew upon decaying rattan chairs in shady corners of dusty verandas. Young women, slim and yellow, big-eyed, long-haired, moving languidly amongst the dirt and rubbish of their dwellings as if every step they took was going to be their very last. He heard their shrill quarrelings, the squalling of their children, the grunting of their pigs. He smelled the odors of the heaps of garbage in their courtyards, and he was greatly disgusted. But he fed and clothed that shabby multitude, those degenerate descendants of Portuguese conquerors. He was their providence. He kept them singing his praises in the midst of their laziness, of their dirt, of their immense and hopeless squalor, and he was greatly delighted. They wanted much, but he could give them all they wanted without ruining himself. In exchange, he had their silent fear, their loquacious love, their noisy veneration. It is a fine thing to be a providence, and to be told so on every day of one's life. It gives one a feeling of enormously remote superiority, and Willems reveled in it. He did not analyze the state of his mind, but probably his greatest delight lay in the unexpressed but intimate conviction that, should he close his hand, all those admiring human beings would starve. His munificence had demoralized them, an easy task. Since he descended amongst them and married Joanna, they had lost the little aptitude and strength for work they might have had to put forth under the stress of extreme necessity. They lived now by the grace of his will. This was power. Willems loved it. In another, and perhaps a lower plane, his days did not want for their less complex but more obvious pleasures. He liked the simple games of skill billiards, also games not so simple, and calling for quite another kind of skill poker. He had been the aptest pupil of a steady-eyed, sententious American who had drifted mysteriously into Macassar from the wastes of the Pacific and, after knocking about for a time in the eddies of town life, had drifted out enigmatically into the sunny solitudes of the Indian Ocean. The memory of the Californian stranger was perpetuated in the game of poker which became popular in the capital of Celebes from that time, and in a powerful cocktail, the recipe for which is transmitted in the Kwantung dialect from head boy to head boy of the Chinese servants in the Sunda Hotel, even to this day. Willems was a connoisseur in the drink and an adept at the game. Of those accomplishments he was moderately proud. Of the confidence reposed in him by Hudig the master he was boastfully and obtrusively proud. This arose from his great benevolence and from an exalted sense of his duty to himself and the world at large. He experienced that irresistible impulse to impart information which is inseparable from gross ignorance. There is always some one thing which the ignorant man knows, and that thing is the only thing worth knowing. It fills the ignorant man's universe. Willems knew all about himself. On the day when, with many misgivings, he ran away from a Dutch East Indiaman in Semarang roads, he had commenced that study of himself, of his own ways, of his own abilities, of those fate-compelling, qualities of his which led him toward that lucrative position which he now filled. Being of a modest and diffident nature, his successes amazed, almost frightened him, and ended as he got over the succeeding shocks of surprise by making him ferociously conceited. He believed in his genius and his knowledge of the world. Others should know of it also, for their own good and for his greater glory. All those friendly men who slapped him on the back and greeted him noisily should have the benefit of his example. For that he must talk. He talked to them conscientiously. In the afternoon he expounded his theory of success over the little tables, dipping now and then his mustache in the crushed ice of the cocktails. In the evening he would often hold forth, cue in hand, to a young listener across the billiard table. The billiard balls stood still, as if listening also, under the vivid brilliance of the shaded oil lamps hung low over the coif, while away in the shadows of the big room the Chinaman marker would lean warily against the wall, the blank mask of his face looking pale under the mahogany marking board. His eyelids dropped in the drowsy fatigue of late hours and in the buzzing monotony of the unintelligible stream of words poured out by the white man. In a sudden pause of the talk, the game would recommence with a sharp click and go on for a time in the flowing soft whir and the subdued thuds as the balls rolled zigzagging towards the inevitably successful cannon. Through the big windows and the open doors, the salt dampness of the sea, the vague smell of mold and flowers from the garden of the hotel drifted in and mingled with the odor of lamp oil, growing heavier as the night advanced. The players' heads dived into the light as they bent down for the stroke, springing back again smartly into the greenish gloom of broad lampshades. The clock ticked methodically. The unmoved Chinaman continuously repeated the score in a lifeless voice, like a big talking doll, and Willems would win the game. With a remark that it was getting late and that he was a married man, he would say a patronizing good night and step out into the long, empty street. At that hour, its white dust was like a dazzling streak of moonlight, where the eye sought repose in the dimmer gleam of rare oil lamps. Willems walked homewards, following the line of walls overtopped by the luxuriant vegetation of the front gardens. The houses right and left were hidden behind the black masses of flowering shrubs. Willems had the street to himself. He would walk in the middle, his shadow gliding obsequiously before him. He looked down on it complacently. The shadow of a successful man. He would be slightly dizzy with the cocktails and with the intoxication of his own glory. As he often told people, he came east 14 years ago, a cabin boy. A small boy. His shadow must have been very small at that time. He thought with a smile that he was not aware then he had anything even the shadow which he dared call his own. And now he was looking at the shadow of the confidential clerk of Hudig & Co. Going home. How glorious, how good was life for those that were on the winning side. He had won the game of life, also the game of billiards. He walked faster, jingling his winnings, and thinking of the white stone days that had marked the path of his existence. He thought of the trip to Lombok for ponies, that first important transaction confided to him by Hudig. Then he reviewed the more important affairs, the quiet deal in opium, the illegal traffic in gunpowder, the great affair of smuggled firearms, the difficult business of the Rajah of Gok. He carried that last through by sheer pluck. He had bearded the savage old ruler in his council room. He had bribed him with a gilt glass coach, which rumor said was used as a hen coop now. He had over-persuaded him. He had bested him in every way. That was the way to get on. He disapproved of the elementary dishonesty that dips the hand in the cash box, but one could evade the laws and push the principles of trade to their furthest consequences. Some call that cheating. Those are the fools, the weak, the contemptible. The wise, the strong, the respected have no scruples. Where there are scruples, there can be no power. On that text he preached often to the young men. It was his doctrine, and he himself was a shining example of its truth. Night after night he went home thus, after a day of toil and pleasure, drunk with the sound of his own voice, celebrating his own prosperity. On his 30th birthday he went home thus. He had spent in good company a nice, noisy evening, and as he walked along the empty street, the feeling of his own greatness grew upon him, lifted him above the white dust of the road, and filled him with exultation and regrets. He had not done himself justice over there in the hotel. He had not talked enough about himself. He had not impressed his hearers enough. Never mind, some other time. Now he would go home and make his wife get up and listen to him. Why should she not get up and mix a cocktail for him and listen patiently? Just so, she shall. If he wanted, he could make all the D'Souza family get up. He had only to say a word, and they would all come and sit silently in their night vestments on the hard, cold ground of his compound and listen, as long as he wished to go on explaining to them from the top of the stairs how great and good he was. They would. However, his wife would do for tonight. His wife, he winced inwardly. A dismal woman with startled eyes and dolorously drooping mouth that would listen to him in pained wonder and mute stillness. She was used to those night discourses now. She had rebelled once at the beginning, only once. Now, while he sprawled in the long chair and drank and talked, she would stand at the further end of the table, her hands resting on the edge, her frightened eyes watching his lips, without a sound, without a stir, hardly breathing, till he dismissed her with a contemptuous "go-to-bed, dummy." She would draw a long breath then and trail out of the room, relieved but unmoved. Nothing could startle her, make her scold or make her cry. She did not complain, she did not rebel. That first difference of theirs was decisive. Too decisive, thought Willems discontentedly. It had frightened the soul out of her body apparently, a dismal woman. A damned business altogether. What the devil did he want to go and saddle himself? Ah, well, he wanted a home, and the match seemed to please Hudig, and Hudig gave him the bungalow, that flower-bowered house to which he was wending his way in the cool moonlight. And he had the worship of the Da Souza tribe. A man of his stamp could carry off anything, do anything, aspire to anything. In another 5 years those white people who attended the Sunday card parties of the governor would accept him half-caste wife and all. Hooray! He saw his shadow dart forward and wave a hat, as big as a rum barrel, at the end of an arm several yards long. Who shouted hooray? He smiled shamefacedly to himself, and pushing his hands deep into his pockets, walked faster with a suddenly grave face. Behind him to the left, a cigar end glowed in the gateway of Mr. Vink's front yard. Leaning against one of the brick pillars, Mr. Vink, the cashier of Hudig & Co., smoked the last cheroot of the evening. Amongst the shadows of the trim bushes, Mrs. Vink crunched slowly, with measured steps, the gravel of the circular path before the house. "There's Willems going home on foot and drunk, I fancy," said Mr. Vink over his shoulder. "I saw him jump and wave his hat." The crunching of the gravel stopped. "Horrid man," said Mrs. Vink calmly. "I have heard he beats his wife." "Oh no, my dear, no," muttered absently Mr. Vink with a vague gesture. The aspect of Willems as a wife-beater presented to him no interest. How women do misjudge! If Willems wanted to torture his wife, he would have recourse to less primitive methods. Mr. Vink knew Willems well, and believed him to be very able, very smart, objectionably so. As he took the last quick draws at the stump of his cheroot, Mr. Vink reflected that the confidence accorded by Hudig to Willems was open, under the circumstances, to loyal criticism from Hudig's cashier. "He is becoming dangerous. He knows too much. He will have to be got rid of," said Mr. Vink aloud. But Mrs. Vink had gone in already, and after shaking his head he threw away his cheroot and followed her slowly. Willems walked on homeward, weaving the splendid web of his future. The road to greatness lay plainly before his eyes, straight and shining, without any obstacle that he could see. He had stepped off the path of honesty, as he understood it, but he would soon regain it, never to leave it any more. It was a very small matter. He would soon put it right again. Meantime his duty was not to be found out, and he trusted in his skill, in his luck, in his well-established reputation that would disarm suspicion if anybody dared to suspect. But nobody would dare. True, he was conscious of a slight deterioration. He had appropriated temporarily some of Hudig's money, a deplorable necessity. But he judged himself with the indulgence that should be extended to the weaknesses of genius. He would make reparation, and all would be as before. Nobody would be the loser for it, and he would go on unchecked toward the brilliant goal of his ambition. Hudig's partner. Before going up the steps of his house, he stood for a while, his feet well apart, chin in hand, contemplating mentally Hudig's future partner. A glorious occupation. He saw him quite safe, solid as the hills, deep as an abyss, discreet as the grave. Chapter 2. The sea, perhaps because of its saltness, roughens the outside, but keeps sweet the kernel of its servant's soul. The old sea, the sea of many years ago, whose servants were devoted slaves and went from youth to age or to a sudden grave without needing to open the book of life, because they could look at eternity reflected on the element that gave the life and dealt the death. Like a beautiful and unscrupulous woman, the sea of the past was glorious in its smiles, irresistible in its anger, capricious, enticing, illogical, irresponsible, a thing to love, a thing to fear. It cast a spell, it gave joy, it lulled gently into boundless faith. Then with quick and causeless anger it killed. But its cruelty was redeemed by the charm of its inscrutable mystery, by the immensity of its promise, by the supreme witchery of its possible favor. Strong men with childlike hearts were faithful to it, were content to live by its grace, to die by its will. That was the sea before the time when the French mind set the Egyptian muscle in motion and produced a dismal but profitable ditch. Then a great pall of smoke sent out by countless steamboats was spread over the restless mirror of the infinite. The hand of the engineer tore down the veil of the terrible beauty in order that greedy and faithless landlubbers might pocket dividends. The mystery was destroyed. Like all mysteries, it lived only in the hearts of its worshippers. The hearts changed, the men changed. The once loving and devoted servants went out armed with fire and iron, and conquering the fear of their own hearts became a calculating crowd of cold and exacting masters. The sea of the past was an incomparably beautiful mistress with inscrutable face, with cruel and promising eyes. The sea of today is a used-up drudge, wrinkled and defaced by the churned-up wakes of brutal propellers, robbed of the enslaving charm of its vastness, stripped of its beauty, of its mystery, and of its promise. Tom Lingard was a master, a lover, a servant of the sea. The sea took him young, fashioned him body and soul, gave him his fierce aspect, his loud voice, his fearless eyes, his stupidly guileless heart. Generously it gave him his absurd. Faith in himself, his universal love of creation, his wide indulgence, his contemptuous severity, his straightforward simplicity of motive and honesty of aim. Having made him what he was, womanlike, the sea served him humbly and let him bask unharmed in the sunshine of its terribly uncertain favor. Tom Lingard grew rich on the sea and by the sea. He loved it with the ardent affection of a lover. He made light of it with the assurance of perfect mastery. He feared it with the wise fear of a brave man, and he took liberties with it as a spoiled child might do with a paternal and good-natured ogre. He was grateful to it with the gratitude of an honest heart. His greatest pride lay in his profound conviction of its faithfulness, in the deep sense of his unerring knowledge of its treachery. The little brig Flash was the instrument of Lingard's fortune. They came north together, both young, out of an Australian port, and after a very few years there was not a white man in the islands, from Palembang to Ternate, from Ombawa to Palawan, that did not know Captain Tom and his lucky craft. He was liked for. His reckless generosity, for his unswerving honesty, and at first was a little feared on account of his violent temper. Very soon, however, they found him out, and the word went round that Captain Tom's fury was less dangerous than many a man's smile. He prospered greatly after his first and successful fight with the sea robbers, when he rescued, as rumor had it, the yacht of some big wig from home, somewhere down Carimata way, his great popularity began. As years went on, it grew apace. Always visiting out-of-the-way places of that part of the world, always in search of new markets for his cargoes, not so much for profit as for the pleasure of finding them, he soon became known to the Malays, and by his successful recklessness in several encounters with pirates, established the terror of his name. Those white men with whom he had business and who naturally were on the lookout for his weaknesses could easily see that it was enough to give him his Malay title to flatter him greatly. So when there was anything to be gained by it, and sometimes out of pure and unprofitable good nature, they would drop the ceremonious Captain Lingard and address him half seriously as Raja Laut, the King of the Sea. He carried the name bravely on his broad shoulders. He had carried it many years already when the boy Willems ran barefooted on the deck of the ship Cosmopolite IV, in Samarang roads, looking with innocent eyes on the strange shore and obrogating his immediate surroundings with blasphemous lips, while his childish brain worked upon the heroic idea of running away. From the poop of the Flash Lingard saw in the early morning the Dutch ship get lumberingly under way, bound for the eastern ports. Very late in the evening of the same day he stood on the quay of the landing canal, ready to go on board of his brig. The night was starry and clear. The little custom-house building was shut up, and as the gharry that brought him down disappeared up the long avenue of dusty trees leading to the town, Lingard thought himself alone on the quay. He roused up his sleeping boat crew and stood waiting for them to get ready when he felt tug at his coat, and a thin voice said very distinctly, "English captain." Lingard turned round quickly, and what seemed to be a very lean boy jumped back with commendable activity. "Who are you? Where do you spring from?" asked Lingard, in startled surprise. From a safe distance the boy pointed toward a cargo lighter moored to the quay. "Been hiding there, have you?" said Lingard. "Well, what do you want? Speak out, confound you. You did not come here to scare me to death for fun, did you?" The boy tried to explain in imperfect English, but very soon Lingard interrupted him. "I see," he exclaimed. "You ran away from the big ship that sailed this morning. Well, why don't you go to your countrymen here? Ship gone, only a little way to Sarobaya." "Make me go back to the ship," explained the boy. "Best thing for you," affirmed Lingard with conviction. "No," retorted the boy. "Me want stop here, not want go home. Get money here. Home no good. This beats all my going a-fishing," commented the astonished Lingard. "It's money you want? Well, well! And you were not afraid to run away, you bag of bones, you!" The boy intimated that he was frightened of nothing but of being sent back to the ship. Lingard looked at him in meditative silence. "Come closer," he said at last. He took the boy by the chin and, turning up his face, gave him a searching look. "How old are you?" "17." "There's not much of you for 17. Are you hungry?" "A little." "Will you come with me in that brig there?" The boy moved without a word towards the boat and scrambled into the bows. "Knows his place," muttered Lingard to himself as he stepped heavily into the stern sheets and took up the yoke lines. "Give way there." The Malay boat crew lay back together, and the gig sprang away from the quay, heading towards the brig's riding light. Such was the beginning of Willem's career. Lingard learned in half an hour all that there was of Willem's commonplace story. Father outdoor clerk of some shipbroker in Rotterdam, mother dead. The boy quick in learning, but idle in school. The straitened circumstances in the house filled with small brothers and sisters, sufficiently clothed and fed, but otherwise running wild, while the disconsolate widower tramped about all day in a shabby overcoat and imperfect boots on the muddy quays, and in the evening piloted wearily the half-intoxicated foreign skippers amongst the places of cheap delights, returning home late, sick with too much smoking and drinking for company's sake with these men, who expected such attentions in the way of business, who than the offer of the good-natured captain of Cosmopolite IV, who was pleased to do something for the patient and obliging fellow. Young Willem's great joy, his still greater disappointment with the sea that looked so charming from afar, but proved so hard and exacting on closer acquaintance. And then this, running away by a sudden impulse. The boy was hopelessly at variance with the spirit of the sea. He had an instinctive contempt for the honest simplicity of that work which led to nothing he cared for. Lingard soon found this out. He offered to send him home in an English ship, but the boy begged hard to be permitted to remain. He wrote a beautiful hand, became soon perfect in English, was quick at figures, and Lingard made him useful in that way. As he grew older, his trading instincts developed themselves astonishingly, and Lingard left him often to trade in one island or another, while he himself made an intermediate trip to some out-of-the-way place. On Willem's expressing a wish to that effect, Lingard let him enter Hudig's service. He felt a little sore at that abandonment, because he had attached himself, in a way, to his protégé. Still, he was proud of him and spoke up for him loyally. At first it was, "Smart boy that never make a seaman though." Then when Willems was helping in the trading, he referred to him as "that clever young fellow." Later, when Willems became the confidential agent of Hudig, employed in many a delicate affair, the simple-hearted old seaman would point an admiring finger at his back and whisper to whoever stood near at the moment, "Long-headed chap that, deuced long-headed chap. Look at him. Confidential man of old Hudig. I picked him up in a ditch, you may say, like a starved cat. Skin and bone. 'Pon my word, I did. And now he knows more than I do about island trading. Fact, I am not joking. More than I do, he would repeat, seriously, with innocent pride in his honest eyes." From the safe elevation of his commercial successes, Willems patronized Lingard. He had a liking for his benefactor, not unmixed with some disdain for the crude directness of the old fellow's methods of conduct. There were, however, certain sides of Lingard's character for which Willems felt a qualified respect. The talkative seaman knew how to be silent on certain matters that to Willems were very interesting. Besides, Lingard was rich, and that in itself was enough to compel Willems' unwilling admiration. In his confidential chats with Hudig, Willems generally alluded to the benevolent Englishman as the lucky old fool in a very distinct tone of vexation. Hudig would grunt an unqualified assent, and then the two would look at each other in a sudden immobility of pupils fixed by a stare of unexpressed thought. "You can't find out where he gets all that India rubber, hey, Willems?" Hudig would ask at last, turning away and bending over the papers on his desk. "No, Mr. Hudig, not yet. But I am trying," was Willem's invariable reply, delivered with a ring of regretful deprecation. "Try, always try, you may try." "You think yourself clever, perhaps," rumbled on Hudig, without looking up. "I have been trading with him 20-30 years now, the old fox, and I have tried. Bah!" He stretched out a short podgy leg and contemplated the bare instep and the grass slipper hanging by the toes. "You can't make him drunk?" he would add, after a pause of stertorous breathing. "No, Mr. Hudig, I can't really," protested Williams earnestly. "Well, don't try. I know him." "Don't try," advised the master, and, bending again over his desk, his staring bloodshot eyes close to the paper, he would go on tracing laboriously with his thick fingers the slim, unsteady letters of his correspondence, while Williams waited respectfully for his further good pleasure before asking, with great deference, "Any orders, Mr. Hudig?" Yes. Go to Bunheim yourself and see the dollars of that payment counted and packed, and have them put on board the mail boat for Ternate. She's due here this afternoon." "Yes, Mr. Hudig. And look here, if the boat is late, leave the case in Bunheim's go-down till tomorrow. Seal it up. 8 seals as usual. Don't take it away till the boat is here. No, Mr. Hudig. And don't forget about these opium cases. It's for tonight. Use my own boatmen. Transship them from the Caroline to the Arab bark," went on the master in his hoarse undertone. "And don't you come to me with another story of a case dropped overboard like last time," he added, with sudden ferocity, looking up at his confidential clerk. "No, Mr. Hudig, I will take care. That's all. Tell that pig as you go out that if he doesn't make the punka go a little better, I will break every bone in his body," finished up Hudig, wiping his purple face with a red silk handkerchief nearly as big as a counterpane. Noiselessly Williams went out, shutting carefully behind him the little green door through which he passed to the warehouse. Hudig, pen in hand, listened to him bullying the punka boy with profane violence, born of unbounded zeal for the master's comfort, before he returned to his writing amid the rustling of papers, fluttering in the wind, sent down by the punka that waved in wide sweeps above his head. Williams would nod familiarly to Mr. Vink, who had his desk close to the little door of the private office, and marched down the warehouse with an important air. Mr. Senno. Vink, extreme dislike lurking in every wrinkle of his gentlemanly countenance, would follow with his eyes the white figure flitting in the gloom amongst the piles of bales and cases till it passed out through the big archway into the glare of the street. Chapter 3. The opportunity and the temptation were too much for Williams, and under the pressure of sudden necessity he abused that trust which was his pride, the perpetual sign of his cleverness, and a load too heavy for him to carry. A run of bad luck at cards, the failure of a small speculation undertaken on his own account, an unexpected demand for money from one or another member of the Da Souza family, and almost before he was well aware of it he was off the path of his peculiar honesty. It was such a faint and ill-defined track that it took him some time to find out how far he had strayed amongst the brambles of the dangerous wilderness he had been skirting for so many years without any other guide than his own convenience, and that doctrine of success which he had found for himself in the book of life in those interesting chapters that the devil has been permitted to write in it, to test the sharpness of men's eyesight and the steadfastness of their hearts. For one short, dark, and solitary moment he was dismayed. But he had that courage that will not scale heights, yet will wade. Bravely through the mud if there be no other road. He applied himself to the task of restitution and devoted himself to the duty of not being found out. On his 30th birthday he had almost accomplished the task, and the duty had been faithfully and cleverly performed. He saw himself safe. Again he could look hopefully towards the goal of his legitimate ambition. Nobody would dare to suspect him, and in a few days there would be nothing to suspect. He was elated. He did not know that his prosperity had touched then its high water mark and that the tide was already on the turn. 2 days afterwards he knew. Mr. Vink, hearing the rattle of the door handle, jumped up from his desk where he had been tremulously listening to the loud voices in the private office and buried his face in the big safe with nervous haste. For the last time, Willems passed through the little green door leading to Hodig's sanctum, which, during the past half hour, might have been taken from the fiendish noise within for the cavern of some wild beast. Willems' troubled eyes took in the quick impression of men and things as he came out from the place of his humiliation. He saw the scared expression of the punkah boy, the Chinamen tellers sitting on their heels with unmovable faces turned up blankly towards him while their arrested hands hovered over the little piles of bright guilders ranged on the floor, Mr. Vink's shoulder blades with the fleshy rims of 2 red ears above. He saw the long avenue of gin cases stretching from where he stood to the arched doorway beyond which he would be able to breathe, perhaps. A thin rope's end lay across his path, and he saw it distinctly, yet stumbled heavily over it as if it had been a bar of iron. Then he found himself in the street at last, but could not find air enough to fill his lungs. He walked towards his home, gasping. As the sound of Hodig's insults that lingered in his ears grew fainter by the lapse of time, the feeling of shame was replaced slowly by a passion of anger against himself, and still more against the stupid concourse of circumstances that had driven him into his idiotic indiscretion. Idiotic indiscretion, that is how he defined his guilt to himself. Could there be anything worse from the point of view of his undeniable cleverness? What a fatal aberration of an acute mind! He did not recognize himself there. He must have been mad, that's it. A sudden gust of madness. And now the work of long years was destroyed utterly. What would become of him? Before he could answer that question, he found himself in the garden before his house, Hodig's wedding gift. He looked at it with a vague surprise to find it there. His past was so utterly gone from him that the dwelling which belonged to it appeared to him incongruous standing there intact, neat and cheerful in the sunshine of the hot afternoon. The house was a pretty little structure, all doors and windows, surrounded on all sides by the deep veranda supported on slender columns, clothed in the green foliage of creepers, which also fringed the overhanging eaves of the high-pitched roof. Slowly, Willems mounted the dozen steps that led to the veranda. He paused at every step. He must tell his wife. He felt frightened at the prospect, and his alarm dismayed him. Frightened to face her. Nothing could give him a better measure of the greatness of the change around him, and in him, another man and another life with the faith in himself gone. He could not be worth much if he was afraid to face that woman. He dared not enter the house through the open door of the dining room, but stood irresolute by the little work table where trailed a white piece of calico, with a needle stuck in it as if the work had been left hurriedly. The pink-crested cockatoo started, on his appearance, into clumsy activity, and began to climb laboriously up and down his perch, calling Joanna with indistinct loudness and a persistent screech that prolonged the last syllable of the name, as if an appeal of insane laughter. The screen in the doorway moved gently once or twice in the breeze, and each time Willem started slightly, expecting his wife, but he never lifted his eyes, although straining his ears for the sound of her footsteps. Gradually he lost himself in his thoughts, in the endless speculation as to the manner in which he would receive his news and his orders. In this preoccupation, he almost forgot the fear of her presence. No doubt she will cry, she will lament, she will be helpless and frightened and passive as ever, and he would have to drag that limp weight on and on through the darkness of a spoiled life. Horrible! Of course he could not abandon her and the child to certain misery or possible starvation. The wife and the child of Willems. Willems the successful, the smart, Willems the conned. Pah! And what was Willems now? Willems the... He strangled the half-born thought and cleared his throat to stifle a groan. Ah! Won't they talk tonight in the billiard room, his world, where he had been first all those men to whom he had been so superciliously condescending? Won't they talk with surprise and affected regret and grave faces and wise nods? Some of them owed him money, but he never pressed anybody. Not he. Willems, the Prince of Good Fellows, they called him. And now they will rejoice, no doubt, at his downfall. A crowd of imbeciles. In his abasement he was yet aware of his. Superiority over those fellows who were merely honest or simply not found out yet. A crowd of imbeciles. He shook his fist at the evoked image of his friends, and the startled parrot fluttered its wings and shrieked in desperate fright. In a short glance upwards, Willem saw his wife come round the corner of the house. He lowered his eyelids quickly and waited silently till she came near and stood on the other side at the little table. He would not look at her face, but he could see the red dressing gown he knew so well. She trailed through life in that red dressing gown with its row of dirty blue bows down the front, stained and hooked on awry. A torn flounce at the bottom following her like a snake as she moved languidly about, with her hair negligently caught up, and a tangled wisp straggling untidily down her back. His gaze traveled upwards from bough to bough, noticing those that hung only by a thread, but it did not go beyond her chin. He looked at her lean throat, at the obtrusive collarbone visible in the disarray of the upper part of her attire. He saw the thin arm and the bony hand clasping the child she carried, and he felt an immense distaste for those encumbrances of his life. He waited for her to say something, but as he felt her eyes rest on him in unbroken silence, he sighed and began to speak. It was a hard task. He spoke slowly, lingering amongst the memories of this early life in his reluctance to confess that this was the end of it and the beginning of a less splendid existence. In his conviction of having made her happiness in the full satisfaction of all material wants, he never doubted for a moment that she was ready to keep him company on no matter how hard and stony a road. He was not elated by this certitude. He had married her to please Hudig, and the greatness of his sacrifice ought to have made her happy without any further exertion on his part. She had years of glory as Willem's wife, and years of comfort, of loyal care, and of such tenderness as she deserved. He had guarded her carefully from any bodily hurt, and of any other suffering he had no conception. The assertion of his superiority was only another benefit conferred on her. All this was a matter. Of course, but he told her all this so as to bring vividly before her the greatness of her loss. She was so dull of understanding that she would not grasp it else. And now it was at an end. They would have to go, leave this house, leave this island, go far away where he was unknown. To the English Strait settlements, perhaps. He would find an opening there for his abilities and juster men to deal with than old Hudig. He laughed bitterly. "You have the money I left at home this morning, Joanna?" he asked. "We will want it all now." As he spoke those words, he thought he was a fine fellow. Nothing knew that. Still, he surpassed there his own expectations. Hang it all, there are sacred things in life after all. The marriage tie was one of them, and he was not the man to break it. The solidity of his principles cost him great satisfaction, but he did not care to look at his wife for all that. He waited for her to speak. Then he would have to console her, tell her not to be a crying fool, to get ready to go. Go where? How? When? He shook his head. They must leave at once. That was the principal thing. He felt a sudden need to hurry up his departure. Well, Joanna, he said, a little impatiently, don't stand there in a trance. Do you hear? We must. He looked up at his wife, and whatever he was going to add remained unspoken. She was staring at him with her big slanting eyes that seemed to him twice their natural size. The child, its dirty livy face pressed to its mother's shoulder, was sleeping peacefully. The deep silence of the house was not broken, but rather accentuated by the low mutter of the cockatoo, now very still on its perch. As Willems was looking at Joanna, her upper lip was drawn up on one side, giving to her melancholy face a vicious expression altogether new to his experience. He stepped back in his surprise. "Oh, you great man," she said distinctly, but in a voice that was hardly above a whisper. Those words, and still more her tone, stunned him as if somebody had fired a gun close to his ear. He stared back at her stupidly. "Oh, you great man," she repeated slowly, glancing right and left as if meditating a sudden escape. "And you think that I am going to starve with you? You are nobody now. You think my mamma and Leonard would let me go away? And with you, she repeated scornfully, raising her voice, which woke up the child and caused it to whimper feebly. "Joanna," exclaimed Willems, "do not speak to me. I have heard what I have waited for all these years. You are less than dirt, you that have wiped your feet on me. I have waited for this. I am." "Not afraid now. I do not want you. Do not come near me." "Ah!" she screamed shrilly as he held out his hand in an entreating gesture. "Ah! Keep off me! Keep off me! Keep off me!" She backed away, looking at him with eyes both angry and frightened. Willem stared motionless in dumb amazement at the mystery of anger and revolt in the head of his wife. Why? What had he ever done to her? This was the day of injustice indeed. First Hudig and now his wife. He felt a terror at this hate that had lived stealthily so near him for years. He tried to speak, but she shrieked again, and it was like a needle through his heart. Again he raised his hand. "Help!" called Mrs. Willems in a piercing voice. "Help!" "Be quiet, you fool!" shouted Willems, trying to drown the noise of his wife and child in his own angry accents and rattling violently the little zinc table in his exasperation. From under the house, where there were bathrooms and a tool closet, appeared Leonard, a rusty iron bar in his hand. He called threateningly from the bottom of the stairs. "Do not hurt her, Mr. Willems. You are a savage, not at all like we whites." "You too," said the bewildered Willems. "I haven't touched her. Is this a madhouse?" He moved towards the stairs, and Leonard dropped the bar with a clang and made for the gate of the compound. Willems turned back to his wife. "So you expected this," he said. "It is a conspiracy. Who's that sobbing and groaning in the room? Some more of your precious family, hey?" She was more calm now, and putting hastily the crying child in the big chair, walked towards him with sudden fearlessness. "My mother," she said. "My mother who came to defend me from you, man. From nowhere, a vagabond. You did not call me a vagabond when you hung round my neck before we were married," said Willems, contemptuously. "You took good care that I should not hang round your neck after we were," she answered, clenching her hands and putting her face close to his. You boasted while I suffered and said nothing. What has become of your greatness, of our greatness you were always speaking about? Now I am going to live on the charity of your master. Yes, that is true. He sent Leonard to tell me so. And you will go and boast somewhere else and starve. So. Ah, I can breathe now. This house is mine. Enough, said Willem slowly with an arresting gesture. She leaped back, the fright again in her eyes, snatched up the child, pressed it to her breast, and falling into a chair, drummed insanely with her heels on the resounding floor of the veranda. I shall go, said Willem steadily. I thank you. For the first time in your life, you make me happy. You were a stone round my neck. You understand. I did not mean to tell you that as long as you lived, but you made me now. Before I pass this gate you shall be gone from my mind. You made it very easy. I thank you. He turned and went down the steps without giving her a glance, while she sat upright and quiet, with wide-open eyes, the child crying querulously in her arms. At the gate he came suddenly upon Leonard, who had been dodging about there, and failed to get out of the way in time. Do not be brutal, Mr. Willems, said Leonard hurriedly. It is unbecoming between white men with all those natives looking on. Leonard's legs trembled very much, and his voice wavered between high and low tones without any attempt at control on his part. Restrain your improper violence, he went on mumbling rapidly. I am a respectable man of very good family, while you, it is regrettable, they all say so. What? Thundered Willems. He felt a sudden impulse of mad anger, and before he knew what had happened, he was looking at Leonard de Souza, rolling in the dust at his feet. He stepped over his prostrate brother-in-law and tore blindly down the street, everybody making way for the frantic white man. When he came to himself, he was beyond the outskirts of the town, stumbling on the hard and cracked earth of reach rice fields. How did he get there? It was dark. He must get back. As he walked towards the town slowly, his mind reviewed the events of the day, and he felt a sense of bitter loneliness. His wife had turned him out of his own house. He had assaulted brutally his brother-in-law, a member of the Dos Souza family of that band of his worshippers. He did. Well, no, it was some other man. Another man was coming back, a man without a past, without a future, yet full of pain and shame and anger. He stopped and looked round. A dog or two glided across the empty street and rushed past him with a frightened snarl. He was now in the midst of the Malay quarter, whose bamboo houses, hidden in the verdure of their little gardens, were dark and silent. Men, women, and children slept in there. Human beings. Would he ever sleep, and where? He felt as if he was the outcast of all mankind, and as he looked hopelessly round, before resuming his weary march, it seemed to him that the world was bigger, the night more vast and more black, but he went on doggedly with his head down, as if pushing his way through some thick brambles. Then suddenly he felt planks under his feet, and, looking up, saw the red mite at the end of the jetty. He walked quite to the end, and stood leaning against the post under the lamp, looking at the roadstead where two vessels at anchor swayed their slender rigging amongst the stars. The end of the jetty, and here in one step, more the end of life, the end of everything. Better so, what else could he do? Nothing ever comes back. He saw it clearly. The respect and admiration of them all, the old habits and old affections finished abruptly in the clear perception of the cause of his disgrace. He saw all this, and for a time he came out of himself, out of his selfishness, out of the constant preoccupation of his interests and his desires, out of the temple of self and the concentration of personal thought. his thoughts now wandered home. Standing in the tepid stillness of a starry tropical night, he felt the breath of the bitter east wind. He saw the high and narrow fronts of tall houses under the gloom of a clouded sky, and on muddy quays he saw the shabby, high-shouldered figure, the patient, faded face of the weary man earning bread for the children that waited for him in a dingy home. It was miserable, miserable, but it would never come back. What was there in common between those things? And Willems the clever, Willems the successful. He had cut himself adrift from that home many years ago. Better for him then. Better for the Mao. All this was gone, never to come back again. And suddenly he shivered, seeing himself alone in the presence of unknown and terrible dangers. For the first time in his life he felt afraid of the future because he had lost his faith, the faith in his own success, and he had destroyed it foolishly with his own hands. Chapter 4. His meditation, which resembled slow drifting into suicide, was interrupted by Lingard, who, with a loud, "I've got you at last," dropped his hand heavily on Willem's shoulder. This time it was the old seaman himself, going out of his way to pick up the uninteresting waif, all that there was left of that sudden and sordid shipwreck. To Willems the rough, friendly voice was a quick and fleeting relief, followed by a sharper pang of anger and unavailing regret. That voice carried him back to the beginning of his promising career, the end of which was very visible now from the jetty where they both stood. He shook himself free from the friendly grasp, saying with ready bitterness, "It's all your fault. Give me a push now, do, and send me over. I have been standing here waiting for help. You are the man of all men. You helped at the beginning. You ought to have a hand in the end." "I have better use for you than to throw you to the fishes," said Lingard. Seriously, taking Willems by the arm and forcing him gently to walk up the jetty. "I have been buzzing over this town like a bluebottle fly, looking for you high and low. I have heard a lot. I will tell you what, Willems, you are no saint, that's a fact, and you have not been overwise either. I am not throwing stones," he added hastily as Willems made an effort to get away, "but I am not going to mince matters. Never could. You keep quiet while I talk, can't you?" With a gesture of resignation and a half-stifled groan, Willem submitted to the stronger will, and the two men paced slowly up and down the resounding planks, while Lingard disclosed to Willems the exact manner of his undoing. After the first shock, Willems lost the faculty of surprise and the overpowering feeling of indignation. So it was Vink and Leonard who had served him so. They had watched him, tracked his misdeeds, reported them to Hudig. They had bribed obscure Chinamen, wormed out confidences from tipsy skippers, got at various boatmen, and had pieced out in that way the story of his irregularities. The blackness of this dark intrigue filled him with horror. He could understand Vink. There was no love lost between them. But Leonard, Leonard! "Why, Captain Lingard," he burst out, "the fellow licked my boots." "Yes, yes, yes," said Lingard, testily. "We know that, and you did your best to cram your boot down his throat. No man likes that, my boy. I was always giving money to all that hungry lot," went on Willems passionately. "Always my hand in my pocket. They never had to ask twice." "Just so. Your generosity frightened them. They asked themselves where all that came from, and concluded that it was safer to throw you overboard. After all, Hudik is a much greater man than you, my friend, and they have a claim on him also. What do you mean, Captain Lingard? What do I mean? Repeated Lingard slowly. Why, you are not going to make me believe you did not know your wife was Hudig's daughter. Come now. Willem stopped suddenly and swayed about. Ah, I understand, he gasped. I never heard. Lately I thought there was. But no, I never guessed. Oh, you simpleton, said Lingard, pityingly. "'Pon my word," he muttered to himself, "I don't believe the fellow knew. Well, well. Steady now. Pull yourself together. What's wrong there? She is a good wife to you." "Excellent wife," said Willems in a dreary voice, looking far over the black and scintillating water. "Very well, then," went on Lingard with increasing friendliness. "Nothing wrong there. But did you really think that Hudik was marrying you off and giving you a house and I don't know what, out of love for you?" "I had served him well," answered Willems. "How well? You know yourself through thick and thin. No matter what work and what risk, I was always there, always ready." How well he saw the greatness of his work and the immensity of that injustice which was his reward. She was that man's daughter. In the light of this disclosure, the facts of the last 5 years of his life stood clearly revealed in their full meaning. He had spoken first to Joanna at the gate of their dwelling as he went to his work in the brilliant flush of the early morning, when women and flowers are charming even to the dullest eyes. A most respectable family. 2 women and a young man were his next-door neighbors. Nobody ever came to their little house but the priest, a native from the Spanish islands, now and then. The young man Leonard he had met in town. And was flattered by the little fellow's immense respect for the great Willems. He let him bring chairs, call the waiters, chalk his cues when playing billiards, express his admiration in choice words. He even condescended to listen patiently to Leonard's allusions to our beloved father, a man of official position, a government agent in Cadiz, where he died of cholera. Alas! A victim to duty, like a good Catholic and a good man. It sounded very respectable, and Wilms approved of those feeling references. Moreover, he prided himself upon having no color prejudices and no racial antipathies. He consented to drink curacoa one afternoon on the veranda of Mrs. de Souza's house. He remembered Joanna that day, swinging in a hammock. She was untidy even then, he remembered, and that was the only impression he carried away from that visit. He had no time for love in those glorious days, no time even for a passing fancy, but gradually he fell into the habit of calling almost every day at that little house where he was greeted by Mrs. de Souza's shrill voice screaming for Joanna to come and entertain the gentleman from Hudig and Co., and then the sudden and unexpected visit of the priest. He remembered the man's flat yellow face, his thin legs, his propitiatory smile, his beaming black eyes, his conciliating manner, his veiled hints which he did not understand at the time, how he wondered what the man wanted, and how unceremoniously he got rid of him. And then came vividly into his recollection the morning when he met again that fellow coming out of Hudig's office, and how he was amused at the incongruous visit. And that morning with Hudig, Would he ever forget it? Would he ever forget his surprise as the master, instead of plunging at once into business, looked at him thoughtfully before turning with a furtive smile to the papers on the desk? He could hear him now, his nose in the paper before him, dropping astonishing words in the intervals of wheezy breathing. Heard said, called there often. Most respectable ladies, knew the father very well, estimable, best thing for a young man, settle down. Personally, very glad to hear, thing arranged, suitable recognition of valuable services, best thing to do. And he believed, what credulity, what an ass. Hudig knew the father, rather, and so did everybody else probably, all except himself. How proud he had been of Hudig's benevolent interest in his fate. How proud he was when invited by Hudig to stay with him at his little house in the country where he could meet men of official position as a friend. Vink had been green with envy. Oh yes, he had believed in the best thing and took the girl like a gift of fortune. How he boasted to Hudig of being free from prejudices. The old scoundrel must have been laughing in his sleeve at his fool of a confidential clerk. He took the girl, guessing nothing. How could he? There had been a father of some kind to the common knowledge. Men knew him, spoke about him, a lank man of hopelessly mixed descent, but otherwise apparently unobjectionable. The shady relations came out afterward, but with his freedom from prejudices he did not mind them, because with their humble dependence they completed his triumphant life. Taken in, Hudig had found an easy way to provide for the begging crowd. He had shifted the burden of his youthful vagaries onto the shoulders of his confidential clerk, and while he worked for the master had cheated him, had stolen his very self from him. He was married. He belonged to that woman no matter what she might do, had sworn, for all life, thrown himself away, and that man dared this very morning call him a thief. Damnation! Let go, Lingard, he shouted, trying to get away by a sudden jerk from the watchful old seaman. Let me go and kill that. No, you don't, panted Lingard, hanging on manfully. You want to kill, do you, you lunatic? Ah, I've got you now. Be quiet, I say. They struggled violently, Lingard forcing Willem slowly towards the guard. Rail. Under their feet the jetty sounded like a drum in the quiet night. On the shore end, the native caretaker of the wharf watched the combat, squatting behind the safe shelter of some big cases. The next day he informed his friends, with calm satisfaction, that 2 drunken white men had fought on the jetty. It had been a great fight. They fought without arms, like wild beasts after the manner of white men. No, nobody was killed, or there would have been trouble and a report to make. How could he know why they fought? White men have no reason when they are like that. Just as Lingard was beginning to fear that he would be unable to restrain much longer the violence of the younger man, he felt Willem's muscles relaxing and took advantage of this opportunity to pin him by a last effort to the rail. They both panted heavily, speechless, their faces very close. "All right," muttered Willems at last. "Don't break my back over this infernal." Rail. I will be quiet. "Now you are reasonable," said Lingard, much relieved. "What made you fly into that passion?" he asked, leading him back to the end of the jetty, and still holding him prudently with one hand, he fumbled with the other for his whistle, and blew a shrill and prolonged blast. Over the smooth water of the roadstead came in answer a faint cry from one of the ships at anchor. "My boat will be here directly," said Lingard. "Think of what you are going to do. I sail tonight." "What is there for me to do, except one thing?" said Willems, gloomily. Look here, said Lingard. I picked you up as a boy and consider myself responsible for you in a way. You took your life into your own hands many years ago, but still. He paused, listening till he heard the regular grind of the oars in the rowlocks of the approaching boat, then went on again. I have made it all right with Hudig. You owe him nothing now. Go back to your wife. She is a good woman. Go back to her. Why, Captain Lingard, exclaimed Willems, she? It was most affecting, went on Lingard, without heeding him. I went to your house to look for you, and there I saw her despair. It was heartbreaking. She called for you. She entreated me to find you. She spoke wildly, poor woman, as if all this was her fault. Willems listened amazed. The blind old idiot! How queerly he misunderstood. But if it was true, if it was even true, the very idea of seeing her filled his soul with intense loathing. He did not break his oath, but he would not go back to her. Let hers be the sin of that separation, of the sacred bond broken. He reveled in the extreme purity of his heart, and he would not go back to her. Let her come back to him. He had the comfortable conviction that he would never see her again, and that through her own fault only. In this conviction he told himself solemnly that if she would come to him, he would receive her with generous forgiveness, because such was the praiseworthy solidity of his principles. But he hesitated whether he would or would not disclose to Lingard the revolting completeness of his humiliation. Turned out of his house and by his wife, that woman who hardly dared to breathe in his presence, yesterday. He remained perplexed and silent. No, he lacked the courage to tell the ignoble story. As the boat of the brig appeared suddenly on the black water close to the jetty, Lingard broke the painful silence. I always thought, he said sadly, I always thought you were somewhat. Heartless, Willems, and apt to cast adrift those that thought most of you. I appeal to what is best in you. Do not abandon that woman. I have not abandoned her, answered Willems quickly with conscious truthfulness. Why should I? As you so justly observed, she has been a good wife to me. A very good, quiet, obedient, loving wife. And I love her as much as she loves me, every bit. But as to going back now, to that place where to walk again amongst those men who yesterday were ready to crawl before me, and then feel on my back the sting of their pitying or satisfied smiles. No, I can't. I would rather hide from them at the bottom of the sea, he went on, with resolute energy. I don't think, Captain Lingard, he added, more quietly, I don't think that you realize what my position was there. In a wide sweep of his hand, he took in the sleeping shore from north to south, as if wishing it a proud and threatening goodbye. For a short moment he forgot his downfall in the recollection of his brilliant triumphs. Amongst the men of his class and occupation who slept in those dark houses he had been indeed the first. It is hard, muttered Lingard pensively, but who's the fault? Who's the fault? Captain Lingard, cried Willems, under the sudden impulse of a felicitous inspiration. If you leave me here on this jetty, it's murder. I shall never return to that place alive, wife or no wife. You may just as well cut my throat at once. The old seaman started. Don't try to frighten me, Willems, he said with great severity, and paused. Above the accents of Willem's brazen despair he heard, with considerable uneasiness, the whisper of his own absurd conscience. He meditated for a while with an irresolute air. I could tell you to go and drown yourself, and be damned to you, he said with an unsuccessful assumption of brutality in his manner, but I won't. We are responsible for one another worse luck. I am almost ashamed of myself, but I can understand your dirty pride. I can. Bye. He broke off with a loud sigh and walked briskly to the steps, at the bottom of which lay his boat, rising and falling gently on the slight and invisible swell. Below there, got a lamp in the boat? Well, light it and bring it up, one of you. Hurry now. He tore out a page of his pocketbook, moistened his pencil with great energy and waited, stamping his feet impatiently. I will see this thing through, he muttered to himself, and I will have it all square and ship-shape. See if I don't. Are you going to bring that lamp, you son of? A crippled mud turtle, I am waiting. The gleam of the light on the paper placated his professional anger, and he wrote rapidly. The final dash of his signature curling the paper up in a triangular tear. Take that to this white Tuan's house. I will send the boat back for you in half an hour. The coxswain raised his lamp deliberately to Willem's face. This Tuan, Tao, I know. Quick then, said Lingard, taking the lamp from him, and the man went off at a run. Cassie Mim, to the lady herself, called Lingard after him. Then, when the man disappeared, he turned to Willems. I have written to your wife, he said. If you do not return for good, you do not go back to that house only for another parting. You must come as you stand. I won't have that poor woman tormented. I will see to it that you are not separated for long. Trust me. Willems shivered, then smiled in the darkness. No fear of that, he muttered enigmatically. I trust you implicitly, Captain Lingard, he added in a louder tone. Lingard led the way down the steps, swinging the lamp and speaking over his shoulder. It is the second time, Willems, I take you in hand. Mind, it is the last. The second time, and the only difference between then and now is that you were bare-footed then and have boots now, in 14 years, with all your smartness. A poor result, that. A very poor result. He stood for a while on the lowest platform of the steps, the light of the lamp falling on the upturned face of the stroke oar, who held the gunwale of the boat close alongside, ready for the captain to step in. You see, he went on, argumentatively, fumbling about the top of the lamp, you got yourself so crooked amongst those longshore quill drivers that you could not run clear in any way. That's what comes of such talk as yours, and of such a life. A man sees so much falsehood that he begins to lie to himself. Pah! He said in disgust, there's only one place for an honest man. The sea, my boy, the sea, but you never would. Didn't think there was enough money in it, and now look. He blew the light out and, stepping into the boat, stretched quickly his hand. Towards Willems with friendly care. Willems sat by him in silence, and the boat shoved off sweeping in a wide circle towards the brig. Your compassion is all for my wife, Captain Lingard, said Willems moodily. Do you think I am so very happy? No, no, said Lingard heartily. Not a word more shall pass my lips. I had to speak my mind once, seeing that I knew you from a child, so to speak, and now I shall forget. But you are young yet. Life is very long, he went on, with unconscious sadness. Let this be a lesson to you. He laid his hand affectionately on Willem's shoulder, and they both sat silent till the boat came alongside the ship's ladder. When on board, Lingard gave orders to his mate, and leading Willems on the poop, sat on the breech of one of the brass 6-pounders with which his vessel was armed. The boat went off again to bring back the messenger. As soon as it was seen returning, dark forms appeared on the brig's spars. Then the sails fell in festoons with a swish of their heavy folds and hung motionless under the yards in the dead calm of the clear and dewy night. From the forward end came the clink of the windlass, and soon afterwards the hail of the chief mate, informing Lingard that the cable was hove short. "Hold on everything," held back Lingard. "We must wait for the land breeze before we let go our hold of the ground." He approached Willems, who sat on the skylight, his body bent down, his head low, and his hands hanging listlessly between his knees. "I am going to take you to Samber," he said. "You've never heard of the place, have you? Well, it's up that river of mine about which people talk so much and know so little. I found out the entrance for a ship of Flash's size. It isn't easy." "You'll see. I will show you. You have been at sea long enough to take an interest. Pity you didn't stick to it. Well, I am going there. I have my own trading post in the place. Almayer is my partner. You knew him when he was at Hudig's. Oh, he lives there as happy as a king. Dicey, I have them all in my pocket. The Rajah is an old friend of mine. My word is law, and I am the only trader. No other white man but Almayer had ever been in that settlement. You will live quietly there till I come back from my next cruise to the westward. We shall see then what can be done for you. Never fear. I have no doubt my secret will be safe with you. Keep mum about my river when you get amongst the traders again. There's many would give their ears for the knowledge of it. I'll tell you something. That's where I get all my gutta and rattans. Simply inexhaustible, my boy." While Lingard spoke, Willems looked up quickly, but soon his head fell on his breast in the discouraging certitude that the knowledge he and Hudig had wished for so much had come to him too late. He sat in a listless attitude. "You will help Almayer in his trading if you have a heart for it," continued Lingard, "just to kill time till I come back for you, only 6 weeks or so." Over their heads, the dap sails fluttered noisily in the first faint puff of the breeze. Then, as the airs freshened, the brig tended to the wind, and the silenced canvas lay quietly aback. The mate spoke with low distinctness from the shadows of the quarterdeck. "There's the breeze. Which way do you want to cast her, Captain Lingard?" Lingard's eyes, that had been fixed aloft, glanced down at the dejected figure of the man sitting on the skylight. He seemed to hesitate for a minute. "To the northward," he answered testily, as if annoyed at his own fleeting thought, "and bear a hand there. Every puff of wind is worth money in these seas." He remained motionless, listening to the rattle of blocks and the creaking of trusses as the head yards were hauled round. Sail was made on the ship, and the windlass manned again while he stood still, lost in thought. He only roused himself when a barefooted sea-canny glided past him silently on his way to the wheel. "Put the helm a port, hard over," he said in his harsh sea voice to the man whose face appeared suddenly out of the darkness in the circle of light thrown upwards from the binnacle lamps. The anchor was secured, the yards trimmed, and the brig began to move out of the roadstead. The sea woke up under the push of the sharp cutwater and whispered softly to the gliding craft in that tender and rippling murmur in which it speaks sometimes to those it nurses and loves. Lingard stood by the taffrail listening, with a pleased smile, till the flash began to draw close to the only other vessel in the anchorage. "Here, Willems," he said, calling him to his side. "Thy see that bark here? That's an Arab vessel. White men have mostly given up the game, but this fellow drops in my wake often, and lives in hopes of cutting me out in that settlement. Not while I live, I trust. You see, Willems, I brought prosperity to that place. I composed their quarrels, and saw them grow under my eyes. There's peace and happiness there. I am more master there than His Dutch Excellency down in Batavia ever will be, when some day a lazy man of war blunders at last against the river. I mean to keep the Arabs out of it with their lies and their intrigues. I shall keep the venomous breed out, if it costs me my fortune." The Flash drew quietly abreast of the bark, and was beginning to drop it astern when a white figure started up on the poop of the Arab vessel, and a voice called out, "Greeting to the Rajalaut." "To you greeting," answered Lingard after a moment of hesitating surprise. Then he turned to Willems with a grim smile. "That's Abdullah's voice," he said. "Mighty civil all of a sudden, isn't he? I wonder what it means, just like his impudence. No matter! His civility or his impudence are all one to me. I know that this fellow will be under way and after me like a shot. I don't care. I have the heels of anything that floats in these seas," he added, while his proud and loving glance ran over and rested fondly amongst the brig's lofty and graceful spars. Chapter 5. "It was the writing on his forehead," said Babalatchi, adding a couple of small sticks to the little fire by which he was squatting, and without looking at Lakamba, who lay down supported on his elbow on the other side of the embers. "It was written when he was born, that he should end his life in darkness, and now he is like a man walking in a black night, with his eyes open, yet seeing not. I knew him well when he had slaves, and many wives, and much merchandise, and prows for fighting. Haya, he was a great fighter in the days before the breath of the merciful put out the light in his eyes. He was a pilgrim, and had many virtues. He was brave, his hand was open, and he was a great robber. For many years he led the men that drank blood on the sea, first in prayer and first in fight. Have I not stood behind him when his face was turned to the west? Have I not watched by his side ships with high masts burning in a straight flame on the calm water? Have I not followed him on dark nights amongst sleeping men that woke up only to die? His sword was swifter than the fire from heaven, and struck before it flashed. Hi, Tuan! Those were the days, and that was a leader, and I myself was younger, and in those days there were not so many fire ships with guns that deal fiery death from afar, over the hill and over the forest. Oh, Tuan Lakamba! They dropped whistling fireballs into the creek where our prowess took refuge, and where they dared not follow men who had arms in their hands. He shook his head with mournful regret and threw another handful of fuel on the fire. The burst of clear flame lit up his broad, dark, and pock-marked face, where the big lips, stained with beetle juice, looked like a deep and bleeding gash of a fresh wound. The reflection of the firelight gleamed brightly in his solitary eye, lending it for a moment a fierce animation that died out together with the short-lived flame. With quick touches of his bare hands, he raked the embers into a heap. Then, wiping the warm ash on his waistcloth, his only garment, He clasped his thin legs with his entwined fingers and rested his chin on his drawn up knees. Lakamba stirred slightly without changing his position or taking his eyes off the glowing coals, on which they had been fixed in dreamy immobility. Yes, went on Babalatchi in a low monotone, as if pursuing aloud a train of thought that had its beginning in the silent contemplation of the unstable nature of earthly greatness. Yes, he has been rich and strong, and now he lives on alms, old, feeble, blind and without companions, but for his daughter. The Raja Patalolo gives him rice, and the pale woman his daughter cooks it for he has no slave. I saw her from afar, muttered Lakamba disparagingly. A she-dog with white teeth, like a woman of the Orang Puti. Right, right, assented Babalatchi, but you have not seen her near. Her mother was a woman from the west, a Baghdadi woman with veiled face. Now she goes uncovered, like our women do, for she is poor, and he is blind, and nobody ever comes near them unless to ask for a charm or a blessing and depart quickly for fear of his anger and of the Rajah's hand. You have not been on that side of the river? Not for a long time. If I go— True, true, interrupted Babalatchi soothingly, but I go often alone for your good and look and listen. When the time comes, when we both go together towards the Rajah's campong, it will be to enter and to remain. Lakamba sat up and looked at Babalatchi gloomily. This is good talk once, twice. When it is heard too often it becomes foolish, like the prattle of children. Many, many times have I seen the cloudy sky, and have heard the wind of the rainy seasons, said Babalatchi impressively. And where is your wisdom? It must be with the wind and the clouds of seasons past, for I do not hear it in your talk. Those are the words of the ungrateful, shouted Babalatchi with sudden exasperation. Verily, our only refuge is with the One, the Mighty, the Redresser of— Peace, peace, growled the startled Lakamba. It is but a friend's talk. Babalatchi subsided into his former attitude, muttering to himself. After a while, he went on again in a louder voice. Since the Rajalaut left another white man here in Sambir, the daughter of the blind Omar el-Badavi has spoken to other ears than mine. Would a white man listen to a beggar's daughter? Said Lakamba doubtingly. Hi, I have seen. And what did you see, O one-eyed one? Exclaimed Lakamba contemptuously. I have seen the strange white man walking on the narrow path before the sun could dry the drops of dew on the bushes, and I have heard the whisper of his voice when he spoke through the smoke of the morning fire to that woman, with big eyes and a pale skin, woman in body, but in heart a man. She knows no fear and no shame. I have heard her voice too. He nodded twice at Lakamba sagaciously and gave himself up to silent musing, his solitary eye fixed immovably upon the straight wall of forest on the opposite bank. Lakamba lay silent, staring vacantly. Under them, Lingard's own river rippled softly amongst the piles supporting the bamboo platform of the little watch-house before which they were lying. Behind the house the ground rose in a gentle swell of a low hill cleared of the big timber but thickly overgrown with. The grass and bushes, now withered and burnt up in the long drought of the dry season. This old rice clearing, which had been several years lying fallow, was framed on three sides by the impenetrable and tangled growth of the untouched forest, and on the fourth came down to the muddy river bank. There was not a breath of wind on the land or river, but high above, in the transparent sky, little clouds rushed past the moon, now appearing in her diffused rays with the brilliance of silver, now obscuring her face with the blackness of ebony. far away, in the middle of the river, a fish would leap now and then, with a short splash, the very loudness of which measured the profundity of the overpowering silence that swallowed up the sharp sound suddenly. Lakamba dozed uneasily off, but the wakeful Babalatchi sat thinking deeply, sighing from time to time, and slapping himself over his naked torso incessantly in a vain endeavor to keep off an occasional and wandering mosquito that, rising as high as the platform above the swarms of the riverside, would settle. With a ping of triumph on the unexpected victim, the moon, pursuing her silent and toilsome path, attained her highest elevation, and chasing the shadow of the roof-eaves from Lakamba's face, seemed to hang arrested over their heads. Babalatchi revived the fire and woke up his companion, who sat up yawning and shivering discontentedly. Babalatchi spoke again in a voice which was like the murmur of a brook that runs over the stones, low, monotonous, persistent, irresistible in its power to wear out and to destroy the hardest obstacles. Lakamba listened, silent but interested. They were Malay adventurers, ambitious men of that place and time, the Bohemians of their race. In the early days of the settlement, before the ruler Patalolo had shaken off his allegiance to the Sultan of Koti, Lakamba appeared in the river with 2 small trading vessels. He was disappointed to find already some semblance of organization amongst the settlers of various races who recognized the unobtrusive sway of old Patalolo, and he was not politic enough. To conceal his disappointment, he declared himself to be a man from the East, from those parts where no white man ruled, and to be of an oppressed race but of a princely family. And truly enough, he had all the gifts of an exiled prince. He was discontented, ungrateful, turbulent, a man full of envy and ready for intrigue, with brave words and empty promises forever on his lips. He was obstinate, but his will was made up of short impulses that never lasted long enough to carry him to the goal of his ambition. Received coldly by the suspicious Patalolo, he persisted, permission or no permission, in clearing the ground on a good spot some 14 miles down the river from Sambir, and built himself a house there, which he fortified by a high palisade. As he had many followers and seemed very reckless, the old Raja did not think it prudent at the time to interfere with him by force. Once settled, he began to intrigue. The quarrel of Patalolo with the Sultan of Koti was of his fomenting, but failed to produce the result he expected, because the Sultan could not back him up. Effectively at such a great distance. Disappointed in that scheme, he promptly organized an outbreak of the Bugis settlers and besieged the old Raja in his stockade with much noisy valor and a fair chance of success. But Lingard then appeared on the scene with the armed brig, and the old seaman's hairy forefinger, shaken menacingly in his face, quelled his martial ardor. No man cared to encounter the Rajalaut, and Lakamba, with momentary resignation, subsided into a half-cultivator, half-trader, and nursed in his fortified house his wrath and his ambition, keeping it for use on a more propitious occasion. Still faithful to his character of a prince-pretender, he would not recognize the constituted authorities, answering sulkily the Raja's messenger, who claimed the tribute for the cultivated fields, that the Raja had better come and take it himself. By Lingard's advice, he was left alone, notwithstanding his rebellious mood, and for many days he lived undisturbed amongst his wives and retainers, cherishing that persistent and causeless hope of better times, the possession of which seems to be the universal privilege of exiled greatness. But the passing days brought no change. The hope grew faint and the hot ambition burnt itself out, leaving only a feeble and expiring spark amongst a heap of dull and tepid ashes of indolent acquiescence with the decrees of fate, till Babalatchi fanned it again into a bright flame. Babalatchi had blundered upon the river while in search of a safe refuge for his disreputable head. He was a vagabond of the seas, a true orang-lout, living by rapine and plunder of coasts and ships in his prosperous days, earning his living by honest and irksome toil when the days of adversity were upon him. So, although at times leading the Sulu rovers, he had also served as sarong of country ships, and in that wise had visited the distant seas, beheld the glories of Bombay, the might of the Mascati Sultan, had even struggled in a pious throng for the privilege of touching with his lips the sacred stone of the holy city. He gathered experience and wisdom in many lands, and after attaching himself to Omar el-Badavi, he affected great piety as became a pilgrim, although unable to read the inspired words of the prophet. He was brave and bloodthirsty without any affection, and he hated the white men who interfered with the manly pursuits of throat-cutting, kidnapping, slave-dealing, and fire-raising that were the only possible occupation for a true man of the sea. He found favor in the eyes of his chief, the fearless Omar el-Badavi, the leader of Brunei rovers, whom he followed with unquestioning loyalty through the long years of successful depredation. And when that long career of murder, robbery, and violence received its first serious check at the hands of white men, he stood faithfully by his chief, looked steadily at the bursting shells, was undismayed by the flames of the burning stronghold, by the death of his companions, by the shrieks of their women, the wailing of their children, by the sudden ruin and destruction of all that he deemed indispensable to a happy and glorious existence. The beaten ground between the houses was slippery with blood, and the dark mangroves of the muddy creeks were full of sighs of the dying men who were stricken down before they could see their enemy. They died helplessly, for into the tangled forest there was no escape, and their swift prows, in which they had so often scoured the coast and the seas, now wedged together in the narrow creek, were burning fiercely. Babalatchi, with the clear perception of the coming end, devoted all his energies to saving if it was but only one of them. He succeeded in time. When the end came in the explosion of the stored powder barrels, he was ready to look for his chief. He found him half dead and totally blinded, with nobody near him but his daughter Aisa. The sons had fallen earlier in the day, as became men of their courage. Helped by the girl with the steadfast heart, Babalatchi carried Omar on board the light prow and succeeded in escaping, but with very few companions only. As they hauled their craft into the network of dark and silent creeks, they could hear the cheering of the crews of the man-of-war's boats dashing to the attack of the Jorbral. Rover's village. Aisa, sitting on the high after-deck, her father's blackened and bleeding head in her lap, looked up with fearless eyes at Babalatchi. They shall find only smoke, blood, and dead men, and women mad with fear there, but nothing else living, she said mournfully. Babalatchi, pressing with his right hand the deep gash on his shoulder, answered sadly, "They are very strong. When we fight with them, we can only die. Yet," he added menacingly, "some of us still live. Some of us still live." For a short time he dreamed of vengeance, but his dream was dispelled by the cold reception of the Sultan of Sulu, with whom they sought refuge at first, and who gave them only a contemptuous and grudging hospitality. While Omar, nursed by Isa, was recovering from his wounds, Babalatchi attended industriously before the exalted presence that had extended to them the hand of protection. For all that, When Babalatchi spoke into the Sultan's ears certain proposals of a great and profitable raid, that was to sweep the islands from Ternate to Achin, the Sultan was very angry. "I know you, you men from the west," he exclaimed angrily. "Your words are poison in a ruler's ears. Your talk is of fire and murder and booty, but on our heads falls the vengeance of the blood you drink. Be gone!" There was nothing to be done. Times were changed. So changed that, when a Spanish frigate appeared before the island and a demand was sent to the Sultan to deliver Omar and his companions, Babalatchi was not surprised to hear that they were going to be made the victims of political expediency. But from that sane appreciation of danger to tame submission was a very long step, and then began Omar's second flight. It began arms in hand, for the little band had to fight in the night on the beach for the possession of the small canoes in which those that survived got away at last. The story of that escape lives in the hearts of brave men even to this day. They talk of Babalatchi and of the strong woman who carried her blind father through the surf under the fire of the warship from the north. The companions of that piratical and sunless Aeneas are dead now, but their ghosts wander over the waters and the islands at night after the manner of ghosts, and haunt the fires by which sit armed men, as is meet for the spirits of fearless warriors who died in battle. There they may hear the story of their own deeds, of their own courage, suffering, and death on the lips of living men. That story is told in many places. On the cool mats and breezy verandas of Rajas's houses, it is alluded to disdainfully by impassive statesmen, but amongst armed men that throng the courtyards, it is a tale which stills the murmur of voices and the tinkle of anklets, arrests the passage of the Siri vessel, and fixes the eyes in absorbed gaze. They talk of the fight, of the fearless woman, of the wise man, of long suffering on the thirsty sea in leaky canoes, of those who died. Many died, a few survived. The chief, the woman, and another one who became great. There was no hint of incipient greatness in Babalatchi's unostentatious arrival. In Sambar, he came with Omar and Aiza and a small prow loaded with green coconuts, and claimed the ownership of both vessel and cargo. How it came to pass that Babalatchi, fleeing for his life in a small canoe, managed to end his hazardous journey in a vessel full of a valuable commodity, is one of those secrets of the sea that baffle the most searching inquiry. In truth, nobody inquired much. There were rumors of a missing trading prau belonging to Manado, but they were vague and remained mysterious. Babalatchi tells a story which, it must be said, in justice to Patalolo's knowledge of the world, was not believed. When the Raja ventured to state his doubts, Babalatchi asked him in tones of calm remonstrance whether he could reasonably suppose that two oldish men, who had only one eye amongst them, and a young woman, were likely to gain possession of anything whatever by violence. Charity was a virtue recommended by the Prophet. There were charitable people, and their hand was open to the deserving. Patalolo wagged his aged head doubtingly, and Babalatchi withdrew with a shocked man, and put himself forthwith under Lakamba's protection. The two men who completed the prau's crew followed him into that magnate's campong. The blind Omar, with Aisa, remained under the care of the Raja, and the Raja confiscated the cargo. The prau hauled up on the mudbank at the junction of the two branches of the Pantai, rotted in the rain, warped in the sun, fell to pieces, and gradually vanished into the smoke of household fires of the settlement. Only a forgotten plank and a rib or two, sticking neglected in the shiny ooze for a long time, served to remind Babalatchi during many months that he was a stranger in the land. Otherwise, he felt perfectly at home in Lakamba's establishment, where his peculiar position and influence were quickly recognized and soon submitted to even by the women. He had all a true vagabond's pliability to circumstances and adaptiveness to momentary surroundings, and his readiness to learn from experience that contempt for early principles so necessary to a true statesman. He equaled the most successful politicians of any age, and he had enough persuasiveness and firmness of purpose to acquire a complete mastery over Lakamba's vacillating mind, where there was nothing stable but an all-pervading discontent. He kept the discontent alive, he rekindled the expiring ambition, he moderated the poor exile's not unnatural impatience to attain a high and lucrative position. He, the man of violence, deprecated the use of force, for he had a clear comprehension of the difficult situation. From the same cause, he, the hater of white men, would to some extent admit the eventual expediency of Dutch protection. But nothing should be done in a hurry. Whatever his master Lakamba might think, there was no use in poisoning old Patalolo, he maintained. It could be done, of course, but what then? As long as Lingard's influence was paramount, as long as Almayer, Lingard's representative, was the only great trader of the settlement, it was not worth Lakamba's while, even if it had been possible to grasp the rule of the young state. Killing Almayer and Lingard was so difficult and so risky that it might be dismissed as impracticable. What was wanted was an alliance, somebody to set up against the white men's influence, and somebody who, while favorable to Lakamba, would at the same time be a person of a good standing with the Dutch authorities. A rich and considered trader was wanted. Such a person, once firmly established in Sambir, would help them to oust the old Raja, to remove him from power or from life if there was no other way. Then it would be time to apply to the Orang Blanda for a flag, for a recognition of their meritorious services, for that protection which would make them safe forever. The word of a rich and loyal trader would mean something with the ruler down in Batavia. The first thing to do was to find such an ally and to induce him to settle in Sambir. A white trader would not do. A white man would not fall in with their ideas, would not be trustworthy. The man they wanted should be rich, unscrupulous, have many followers, and be a well-known personality in the islands. Such a man might be found amongst the Arab traders. Lingard's jealousy, said Babalatchi, kept all the traders out of the river. Some were afraid, and some did not know how to get there. Others ignored the very existence of Sambir. A good many did not think it worth their while to run the risk of Lingard's enmity for the doubtful advantage of trade with a comparatively unknown settlement. The great majority were undesirable or untrustworthy, and Babalatchi mentioned regretfully the men he had known in his young days, wealthy, resolute, courageous, reckless, ready for any enterprise. But why lament the past and speak about the dead? There is one man living great not far off. Such was Babalatchi's line of policy laid before his ambitious protector. Lakamba assented, his only objection being that it was very slow work. In his extreme desire to grasp dollars and power, the unintellectual exile was ready to throw himself into the arms of any wandering cutthroat whose help could be secured, and Babalatchi experienced great difficulty in restraining him from unconsidered violence. It would not do to let it be seen that they had any hand in introducing a new element into the social and political life of Sambir. There was always a possibility of failure, and in that case Lingard's vengeance would be swift and certain. No risk should be run. They must wait. Meantime, he pervaded the settlement, squatting in the course of each day by many household fires, testing the public temper and public opinion, and always talking about his impending departure. At night he would often take Lakamba's smallest canoe and depart silently to pay mysterious visits to his old chief on the other side of the river. Omar lived in odor of sanctity under the wing of Patalolo. Between the bamboo fence enclosing the houses of the Raja and the wild forest, there was a banana plantation, and on its further edge stood two little houses built on low piles under a few precious fruit trees that grew on the banks of a clear brook, which, bubbling up behind the house, ran in its short and rapid course down to the big river. along the brook a narrow path led through the dense second growth of a neglected clearing to the banana plantation and to the houses in it, which the Rajah had given for residence to Omar. The Rajah was greatly impressed by Omar's ostentatious piety, by his oracular wisdom, by his many misfortunes, by the solemn fortitude with which he bore his affliction. Often the old ruler of Sambar would visit informally the blind Arab and listen gravely to his talk during the hot hours of an afternoon. In the night, Babalatchi would call and interrupt Omar's repose, unrebuked. Asa, standing silently at the door of one of the huts, could see the two old friends as they sat very still by the fire in the middle of the beaten ground between the two houses, talking in an indistinct murmur far into the night. She could not hear their words, but she watched the two formless shadows curiously. Finally, Babalatchi would rise and, taking her father by the wrist, would lead him back to the house, arrange his mats for him, and go out. Quietly. Instead of going away, Babalatchi, unconscious of Aisa's eyes, often sat again by the fire in a long and deep meditation. Aisa looked with respect on that wise and brave man she was accustomed to see at her father's side, as long as she could remember sitting alone and thoughtful in the silent night by the dying fire, his body motionless and his mind wandering in the land of memories, or who knows, perhaps groping for a road in the waste spaces of the uncertain future. Babalatchi noted the arrival of Willems with alarm at this new accession to the white men's strength. Afterwards, he changed his opinion. He met Willems one night on the path leading to Omar's house, and noticed later on, with only a moderate surprise, that the blind Arab did not seem to be aware of the new white man's visits to the neighborhood of his dwelling. Once, coming unexpectedly in the daytime, Babalatchi fancied he could see the gleam of a white jacket in the bushes on the other side of the brook. That day he watched Aisa pensively as she moved about preparing the evening rice, but after a while he went hurriedly away before sunset, refusing Omar's hospitable invitation in the name of Allah to share their meal. That same evening, he startled Lakamba by announcing that the time had come at last to make the first move in their long-deferred game. Lakamba asked excitedly for explanation. Babalatchi shook his head and pointed to the flitting shadows of moving women and to the vague forms of men sitting by the evening fires in the courtyard. Not a word would he speak here, he declared. But when the whole household was reposing, Babalatchi and Lakamba passed silent among sleeping groups to the riverside and, taking a canoe, paddled off stealthily on their way to the dilapidated guard hut in the old rice clearing. There they were safe from all eyes and ears and could account, if need be, for their excursion by the wish to kill a deer, the spot being well known as the drinking place of all kinds of game. In the seclusion of its quiet solitude, Babalatchi explained his plan to the attentive Lakamba. His idea was to make use of Willems for the destruction of Lengard's influence. "I know the white men, Tuan," he said in conclusion. "In many lands have I seen them, always the slaves of their desires, always ready to give up their strength and their reason into the hands of some woman. The fate of the believers is written by the hand of the Mighty One, but they who worship many gods are thrown into the world with smooth foreheads for any woman's hand to mark their destruction there. Let one white man destroy another. The will of the Most High is that they should be fools. They know how to keep faith with their enemies, but towards each other they know only deception. Hi, I have seen, I have seen." He stretched himself full length before the fire and closed his eye in real or simulated sleep. Lakamba, not quite convinced, sat for a long time with his gaze riveted on the dull embers. As the night advanced, a slight white mist rose from the river, and the declining moon, bowed over the tops of the forest, seemed to seek the repose of the earth, like a wayward and wandering lover who returns at last to lay his tired and silent head on his beloved's breast. Chapter 6. "Lend me your gun, Almayer," said Willems, across the table on which a smoky lamp shone redly above the disorder of a finished meal. "I have a mind to go and look for a deer when the moon rises tonight." Almayer, sitting sidewise to the table, his elbow pushed amongst the dirty plates, his chin on his breast and his legs stretched stiffly out, kept his eyes steadily on the toes of his grass slippers and laughed abruptly. "You might say yes or no instead of making that unpleasant noise," remarked Willems with calm irritation. "If I believed one word of what you say, I would," answered Almayer without changing his attitude and speaking slowly, with pauses, as if dropping his words on the floor. "As it is, what's the use? You know where the gun is, you may take it or leave it. Gun, deer, bosh, hunt deer, posh, hints deer, pah. You are after my honored guest. You want gold anklets and silk sarongs for that game." "Mighty hunter, and you won't get those for the asking, I promise you, all day amongst the natives. A fine help you are to me." "You shouldn't drink so much, Almayer," said Willems, disguising his fury under an affected drawl. "You have no head, never had, as far as I can remember, in the old days in the Kasser. You drink too much." "I drink my own," retorted Almayer, lifting his head quickly and darting an angry glance at Willems. Those two specimens of the superior race glared at each other savagely for a minute, then turned away their heads at the same moment, as if by previous arrangement, and both got up. Almayer kicked off his slippers and scrambled into his hammock, which hung between two wooden columns of the veranda so as to catch every rare breeze of the dry season, and Willems, after standing irresolutely by the table for a short time, walked without a word down the steps. Of the house and over the courtyard towards the little wooden jetty, where several small canoes and a couple of big white whaleboats were made fast, tugging at their short painters and bumping together in the swift current of the river. He jumped into the smallest canoe, balancing himself clumsily, slipped the rattan painter, and gave an unnecessary and violent shove, which nearly sent him headlong overboard. By the time he regained his balance, the canoe had drifted some 50 yards down the river. He knelt in the bottom of his little craft and fought the current with long sweeps of the paddle. Almayer sat up in his hammock, grasping his feet and peering over the river with parted lips till he made out the shadowy form of man and canoe as they struggled past the jetty again. "I thought you would go," he shouted. "Won't you take the gun?" "Hey!" he yelled, straining his voice. Then he fell back in his hammock and laughed to himself feebly till he fell asleep. On the river Willems, his eyes fixed intently. Ahead, swept his paddle right and left, unheeding the words that reached him faintly. It was now 3 months since Lingard had landed Willems in Sambir and had departed hurriedly, leaving him in Almayer's care. The two white men did not get on well together. Almayer, remembering the time when they both served Hudig, and when the superior Willems treated him with offensive condescension, felt a great dislike towards his guest. He was also jealous of Lingard's favor. Almaler had married a Malay girl whom the old seaman had adopted in one of his accesses of unreasoning benevolence, and as the marriage was not a happy one from a domestic point of view, he looked to Lingard's fortune for compensation in his matrimonial unhappiness. The appearance of that man, who seemed to have a claim of some sort upon Lingard, filled him with considerable uneasiness, the more so because the old seaman did not choose to acquaint the husband of his adopted daughter with Willem's history or to confide to him his intentions as to that individual's future fate. Suspicious from the first, Almayer discouraged Willem's attempts to help him in his trading, and then when Willems drew back, he made, with characteristic perverseness, a grievance of his unconcern. From cold civility in their relations, the two men drifted into silent hostility, then into outspoken enmity, and both wished ardently for Lingard's return and the end of a situation that grew more intolerable from day to day. The time dragged slowly. Willems watched the succeeding sunrises, wondering dismally whether before the evening some change would occur in the deadly dullness of his life. He missed the commercial activity of that existence which seemed to him far off, irreparably lost, buried out of sight under the ruins of his past success, now gone from him beyond the possibility of redemption. He mooned disconsolately about Almayer's courtyard, watching from afar, with uninterested eyes, the up-country canoes discharging gutta or rattans and loading rice or European goods on the little wharf of Lingard and Kaw. Big as was the extent of ground owned by Almayer, Willems yet felt that there was not enough room for him inside those neat fences. The man who, during long years, became accustomed to think of himself as indispensable to others, felt a bitter and savage rage at the cruel consciousness of his superfluity, of his uselessness, at the cold hostility visible in every look of the only white man in this barbarous corner of the world. He gnashed his teeth when he thought of the wasted days of the life thrown away in the unwilling company of that peevish and suspicious fool. He heard the reproach of his idleness in the murmurs of the river, in the unceasing whisper of the great forests. Round him everything stirred, moved, swept by in a rush. The earth under his feet and the heavens above his head. The very savages around him strove, struggled, fought, worked if only to prolong a miserable existence, but they lived, and it was only himself that seemed to be left outside the scheme of creation in a hopeless, immobility filled with tormenting anger and with ever-stinging regret. He took to wandering about the settlement. The afterwards flourishing Sambre was born in the swamp and passed its youth in malodorous mud. The houses crowded the bank, and as if to get away from the unhealthy shore, stepped boldly into the river, shooting over it in a close row of bamboo platforms elevated on high piles, amongst which the current below spoke in a soft and unceasing plaint of murmuring eddies. There was only one path in the whole town, and it ran at the back of the houses along the succession of blackened circular patches that marked the place of the household fires. On the other side, the virgin forest bordered the path, coming close to it, as if to provoke impudently any passer-by to the solution of the gloomy problem of its depths. Nobody would accept the deceptive challenge. There were only a few feeble attempts at a clearing here and there, but the ground was low, and the river, retiring after its yearly floods, left on each a gradually diminishing mud-hole, where the imported buffaloes of the Bugis settlers wallowed happily during the heat of the day. When Willems walked on the path, The indolent men stretched on the shady side of the houses looked at him with calm curiosity. The women busy round the cooking fires would send after him wondering and timid glances, while the children would only look once and then run away yelling with fright at the horrible appearance of the man with a red and white face. These manifestations of childish disgust and fear stung Willems with a sense of absurd humiliation. He sought in his walks the comparative solitude of the rudimentary clearings, but the very buffaloes snorted with alarm at his sight, scrambled lumberingly out of the cool mud, and stared wildly in a compact herd at him as he tried to slink unperceived along the edge of the forest. One day, at some unguarded and sudden movement of his, the whole herd stampeded down the path, scattered the fires, sent the women flying with shrill cries, and left behind a track of smashed pots, trampled rice, overturned children, and a crowd of angry men brandishing sticks in loud-voiced pursuit. The innocent cause of that disturbance ran shamefacedly the gauntlet of black looks and unfriendly remarks, and hastily sought refuge in Almayer's campong. After that he left the settlement alone. Later, when the enforced confinement grew irksome, Willems took one of Almayer's many canoes and crossed the main branch of the Pantai in search of some solitary spot where he could hide his discouragement and his weariness. He skirted in his little craft the wall of tangled verdure, keeping in the dead water close to the bank where the spreading nipa palms nodded their broad leaves over his head as if in contemptuous pity of the wandering outcast. Here and there he could see the beginnings of chopped-out pathways, and, with the fixed idea of getting out of sight of the busy river, he would land and follow the narrow and winding path, only to find that it led nowhere, ending abruptly in the discouragement of thorny thickets. He would go back slowly, with a bitter sense of unreasonable disappointment and sadness, oppressed by the hot smell of earth, dampness, and decay in that forest which seemed to push him mercilessly back into the glittering sunshine of the river. And he would recommence paddling with tired arms to seek another opening, to find another deception. As he paddled up to the point where the Rajah's stockade came down to the river, the nipas were left behind rattling their leaves over the brown water, and the big trees would appear on the bank, tall, strong, indifferent in the immense solidity of their life, which endures for ages, to that short and fleeting life in the heart of the man who crept painfully amongst their shadows in search of a refuge from the unceasing reproach of his thoughts. Amongst their smooth trunks, a clear brook meandered for a time, entwining lancets before it made up its mind to take a leap into the hurrying river over the edge of the steep bank. There was also a pathway there, and it seems frequented. Willems landed, and following the capricious promise of the track soon found himself in a comparatively clear space, where the confused tracery of sunlight fell through the branches and the foliage overhead, and lay on the stream that shone in an easy curve like a bright sword blade dropped amongst the long and feathery grass. Further on, the path continued, narrowed again in the thick undergrowth. At the end of the first turning, Willems saw a flash of white and color, a gleam of gold like a sun ray lost in shadow, and a vision of blackness darker than the deepest shade of the forest. He stopped, surprised, and fancied he had heard light footsteps growing lighter ceasing. He looked around. The grass on the bank of the stream trembled, and a tremulous path of its shivering silver-gray tops ran from the water to the beginning of the thicket. And yet there was not a breath of wind. Somebody kind passed there. He looked pensive while the tremor died out in a quick tremble under his eyes, and the grass stood high, unstirring, with drooping heads in the warm and motionless air. He hurried on, driven by a suddenly awakened curiosity, and entered the narrow way between the bushes. At the next turn of the path he caught again the glimpse of colored stuff and of a woman's black hair before him. He hastened his pace and came in full view of the object of his pursuit. The woman, who was carrying two bamboo vessels full of water, heard his footsteps, stopped, and putting the bamboos down half turned to look back. Willems also stood still for a minute, then walked steadily on with a firm tread, while the woman moved aside to let him pass. He kept his eyes fixed straight before him, yet almost unconsciously he took in every detail of the tall and graceful figure. As he approached her, the woman tossed her head slightly back, and with a free gesture of her strong round arm, caught up the mass of loose black hair and brought it over her shoulder and across the lower part of her face. The next moment he was passing her close, walking rigidly like a man in a trance. He heard her rapid breathing, and he felt the touch of a look darted at him from half-open eyes. It touched his brain and his heart together. It seemed to him to be something loud and stirring like a shout, silent and penetrating like an inspiration. The momentum of his motion carried him past her, but an invisible force made up of surprise and curiosity and desire spun him round as soon as he had passed. She had taken up her burden already, with the intention of pursuing her path. His sudden movement arrested her at the first step, and again she stood straight, slim, expectant, with a readiness to dart away suggested in the light immobility of her pose. High above, the branches of the trees met in a transparent shimmer of waving green mist, through which the rain of yellow rays descended upon her head, streamed in glints down her black tresses, shone with the changing glow of liquid metal on her face, and lost itself in vanishing sparks in the somber depths of her eyes that, wide open now, with enlarged pupils, looked steadily at the man in her path. And Willem stared at her, charmed with a charm that carries with it a sense of irreparable loss, tingling with that feeling which begins like a caress and ends in a blow, in that sudden hurt of a new emotion making its way into a human heart, with the brusque stirring of sleeping sensations awakening suddenly to the rush of new hopes, new fears, new desires, and to the flight of one's old self. She moved a step forward and again halted. A breath of wind that came through the trees, but in Willem's fancy seemed to be driven by her moving figure, rippled in a hot wave round his body and scorched his face in a burning touch. He drew it in with a long breath, the last long breath of a soldier before the rush of battle, of a lover before he takes in his arms the adored woman, the breath that gets courage to confront the menace of death or the storm of passion. Who was she? Where did she come from? Wonderingly he took his eyes off her face to look round at the serried trees of the forest that stood big and still and straight, as if watching him and her breathlessly. He had been baffled, repelled, almost frightened by the intensity of that tropical life which wants the sunshine but works in gloom, which seems to be all grace of color and form, all brilliance, all smiles, but is only the blossoming of the dead, whose mystery holds the promise of joy and beauty, yet contains nothing but poison and decay. He had been frightened by the vague perception of danger before, but now, as he looked at that life again, his eyes seemed able to pierce the fantastic veil of creepers and leaves, to look past the solid trunks, to see through the forbidding gloom, and the mystery was disclosed, enchanting, subduing, beautiful. He looked at the woman. Through the checkered light between them she appeared to him with the impalpable distinctness of a dream, the very spirit of that land of mysterious forests, standing before him like an apparition behind a transparent veil, a veil woven of sunbeams and shadows. She had approached him still nearer. He felt a strange impatience within him at her advance. Confused thoughts rushed through his head, disordered, shapeless, stunning. Then he heard his own voice asking, "Who are you?" "I am the daughter of the blind Omar," she answered, in a low but steady tone. "And you," she went on, a little louder, You are the white trader, the great man of this place." "Yes," said Willems, holding her eyes with his in a sense of extreme effort. "Yes, I am white." Then he added, feeling as if he spoke about some other man, "But I am the outcast of my people." She listened to him gravely. Through the mesh of scattered hair, her face looked like the face of a golden statue with living eyes. The heavy eyelids dropped slightly, and from between the long eyelashes she sent out a sidelong look, hard, keen and narrow, like the gleam of sharp steel. Her lips were firm and composed in a graceful curve, but the distended nostrils, the upward poise of the half-averted head, gave to her whole person the expression of a wild and resentful defiance. A shadow passed over Willem's face. He put his hand over his lips, as if to keep back the words that wanted to come out in the surge of impulsive necessity, the outcome of dominant thought that rushes from the heart to the brain and must be spoken in the face of doubt, of danger, of fear, of destruction itself. "You are beautiful," he whispered. She looked at him again with a glance that, running in one quick flash of her eyes over his sunburned features, his broad shoulders, his straight, tall, motionless figure, rested at last on the ground at his feet. Then she smiled. In the somber beauty of her face, that smile was like the first ray of light on a stormy daybreak. That darts evanescent and pale through the gloomy clouds, the forerunner of sunrise and of thunder. Chapter 7. There are in our lives short periods which hold no place in memory but only as the recollection of a feeling. There is no remembrance of gesture, of action, of any outward manifestation of life. Those are lost in the unearthly brilliance or in the unearthly gloom of such moments. We are absorbed in the contemplation of that something within our bodies which rejoices or suffers while the body goes on breathing, instinctively runs away, or, not less instinctively, fights, perhaps dies. But death in such a moment is the privilege of the fortunate. It is a high and rare favor, a supreme grace. Willems never remembered how and when he parted from Maessa. He caught himself drinking the muddy water out of the hollow of his hand, while his canoe was drifting in midstream past the last houses of Sambir. With his returning wits came the fear of something unknown that had taken possession of his heart, of something inarticulate and masterful which could not speak and would be obeyed. His first impulse was that of revolt. He would never go back there. Never. He looked round slowly at the brilliance of things in the deadly sunshine and took up his paddle. How changed everything seemed! The river was broader, the sky was higher. How fast the canoe flew under the strokes of his paddle! Since when had he acquired the strength of 2 men or more? He looked up and down the reach at the forests of the bank with a confused notion that with one sweep of his hand he could tumble all these trees into the stream. His face felt burning. He drank again and shuddered with a depraved sense of pleasure at the aftertaste of slime in the water. It was late when he reached Almayer's house, but he crossed the dark and uneven courtyard, walking lightly in the radiance of some light of his own, invisible to other eyes. His host's sulky greeting jarred him like a sudden fall down a great height. He took his place at the table opposite Almayer and tried to speak cheerfully to his gloomy companion. But when the meal was ended and they sat smoking in silence, he felt an abrupt discouragement, a lassitude in all his. Lens, a sense of immense sadness as after some great and irreparable loss. The darkness of the night entered his heart, bringing with it doubt and hesitation and dull anger with himself and all the world. He had an impulse to shout horrible curses, to quarrel with Almayer, to do something violent. quite without any immediate provocation, he thought he would like to assault the wretched, sulky beast. He glanced at him ferociously from under his eyebrows. The unconscious Almayer smoked thoughtfully, planning tomorrow's work probably. The man's composure seemed to Willems an unpardonable insult. Why didn't that idiot talk tonight when he wanted him to? On other nights he was ready enough to chatter, and such dull nonsense too. And Willems, trying hard to repress his own senseless rage, looked fixedly through the thick tobacco smoke at the stained tablecloth. They retired early, as usual, but in the middle of the night Willems leaped out of his hammock with a stifled execration and ran down the steps into the courtyard. The two night watchmen, who sat by a little fire talking together in a monotonous undertone, lifted their heads to look wonderingly at the discomposed features of the white man as he crossed the circle of light thrown out by their fire. He disappeared in the darkness and then came back again, passing them close, but with no sign of consciousness of their presence on his face. Backwards and forwards he paced, muttering to himself, and the two Mullanees, after a short consultation in whispers, left the fire quietly, not thinking it safe to remain in the vicinity of a white man who behaved in such a strange manner. They retired round the corner of the go-down and watched Willems curiously through the night, till the short daybreak was followed by the sudden blaze of the rising sun, and Almayer's establishment woke up to life and work. As soon as he could get away unnoticed in the bustle of the busy riverside, Willems crossed the river on his way to the place where he had met Ayesha. He threw himself down in the grass by the side of the brook and listened for the sound of her footsteps. The brilliant light of day fell through the irregular opening in the high branches of the trees and streamed down, softened, amongst the shadows of big trunks. Here and there a narrow sunbeam touched the rugged bark of a tree with a golden splash, sparkled on the leaping water of the brook, or rested on a leaf that stood out, shimmering and distinct, on the monotonous background of somber green tints. The clear gap of blue above his head was crossed by the quick flight of white rice birds whose wings flashed in the sunlight, while through it the heat poured down from the sky, clung about the steaming earth, rolled among the trees, and wrapped up Willems in the soft and odorous folds of air. Heavy with the faint scent of blossoms and with the acrid smell of decaying life. And in that atmosphere of nature's workshop, Willems felt soothed and lulled into forgetfulness of his past, into indifference as to his future. The recollections of his triumphs, of his wrongs and of his ambition vanished in that warmth which seemed to melt all regrets, all hope, all anger, all. Strength out of his heart, and he lay there, dreamily contented, in the tepid and perfumed shelter, thinking of Ayesha's eyes, recalling the sound of her voice, the quiver of her lips, her frowns and her smile. She came, of course. To her he was something new, unknown and strange. He was bigger, stronger than any man she had seen before, and altogether different from all those she knew. He was of the victorious race. With the vivid remembrance of the great catastrophe of her life, he appeared to her with all the fascination of a great and dangerous thing, of a terror vanquished, surmounted, made a plaything of. They spoke with just such a deep voice, those victorious men, they looked with just such hard blue eyes at their enemies. And she made that voice speak softly to her. Those eyes looked tenderly at her face. He was indeed a man. She could not understand all he told her of his life, but the fragments she understood she made up for herself into a story of a man great amongst his own people, valorous and unfortunate, an undaunted fugitive dreaming of vengeance. against his enemies. He had all the attractiveness of the vague and the unknown, of the unforeseen and of the sudden, of a being strong, dangerous, alive and human, ready to be enslaved. She felt that he was ready. She felt it with the unerring intuition of a primitive woman confronted by a simple impulse. Day after day, when they met and she stood a little way off, listening to his words, holding him with her look, the undefined terror of the new conquest became faint and blurred like the memory of a dream. And the certitude grew distinct and convincing and visible to the eyes like some material thing in full sunlight. It was a deep joy, a great pride, a tangible sweetness that seemed to leave the taste of honey on her lips. He lay stretched at her feet without moving, for he knew from experience how a slight movement of his could frighten her away in those first days of their intercourse. He lay very quiet, with all the ardor of his desire ringing in his voice and shining in his eyes, whilst his body was still, like death itself. And he looked at her, standing above him, her head lost in the shadow of broad and graceful leaves that touched her cheek, while the slender spikes of pale green orchids streamed down from amongst the boughs and mingled with the black hair that framed her face, as if all those plants claimed her for their own, the animated and brilliant flower of all that exuberant life, which, born in gloom, struggles forever towards the sunshine. Every day she came a little nearer. He watched her slow progress, the gradual taming of that woman by the words of his love. It was the monotonous song of praise and desire that, commencing at creation, wraps up the world like an atmosphere and shall end only in the end of all things, when there are no lips to sing and no ears to hear. He told her that she was beautiful and desirable, and he repeated it again and again. For when he told her that, he had said all there was within him, he had expressed his only thought, his only feeling, and he watched the startled look of wonder and mistrust vanish from her face with the passing days. Her eyes soften, the smile dwell longer and longer on her lips, a smile as of one charmed by a delightful dream, with the slight exaltation of intoxicating triumph lurking in its dawning tenderness. And while she was near, there was nothing in the whole world for that idle man but her look and her smile. Nothing in the past, nothing in the future, and in the present only the luminous fact of her existence. But in the sudden darkness of her going, he would be left weak and helpless, as though despoiled violently of all that was himself. He who had lived all his life with no preoccupation but that of his own career, contemptuously indifferent to all feminine influence, full of scorn for men that would submit to it if ever so little, he, so strong, so superior even in his errors, realized at last that his very individuality was snatched from within himself by the hand of a woman. Where was the assurance and pride of his cleverness, the belief in success, the anger of failure, the wish to retrieve his fortune, the certitude of his ability to accomplish it yet? Gone, all that. Had been a man within him was gone, and there remained only the trouble of his heart, that heart which had become a contemptible thing, which could be fluttered by a look or a smile, tormented by a word, soothed by a promise. When the longed-for day came at last, when she sank on the grass by his side and with a quick gesture took his hand in hers, he sat up suddenly with the movement and look of a man awakened by the crash of his own falling house. All his blood, all his sensation, all his life seemed to rush into that hand, leaving him without strength in a cold shiver, in the sudden clamminess and collapse as of a deadly gunshot wound. He flung her hand away brutally like something burning and sat motionless, his head fallen forward, staring on the ground and catching his breath in painful gasps. His impulse of fear and apparent horror did not dismay her in the least. Her face was grave and her eyes looked seriously at him. Her fingers touched the hair of his temple, ran in a light caress down his cheek, twisted gently the end of his long mustache, and while he sat in the tremor of that contact, she ran off with startling fleetness and disappeared in a peal of clear laughter, in the stir of grass, in the nod of young twigs growing over the path, leaving behind only a vanishing trail of motion and sound. He scrambled to his feet slowly and painfully, like a man with a burden on his shoulders, and walked towards the riverside. He hugged to his breast the recollection of his fear and of his delight, but told himself seriously over and over again that this must be the end of that adventure. After shoving off his canoe into the stream, he lifted his eyes to the bank and gazed at it long and steadily, as if taking his last look at a place of charming memories. He marched up to Almayer's house with the concentrated expression and the determined step of a man who had just taken a momentous resolution. His face was set and rigid. His gestures and movements were guarded and slow. He was keeping a tight hand on himself, a very tight hand. He had a vivid illusion, as vivid as reality almost, of being in charge of a slippery prisoner. He sat opposite Almayer during that dinner, which was their last meal together, with a perfectly calm face, and within him a growing terror of escape from his own self. Now and then he would grasp the edge of the table and set his teeth hard in a sudden wave of acute despair, like one who, falling down a smooth and rapid declivity that ends in a precipice, digs his fingernails into the yielding surface and feels himself slipping helplessly to inevitable destruction. Then, abruptly, came a relaxation of his muscles, the giving way of his will. Something seemed to snap in his head, and that wish, that idea kept back during all those hours, darted into his brain with the heat and noise of a conflagration. He must see her at once, go now, tonight. He had the raging regret of the lost hour, of every passing moment. There was no thought of resistance now, yet with the instinctive fear of the irrevocable, with the innate falseness of the human heart, he wanted to keep open the way of retreat. He had never absented himself during the night. What did Almayer know? What would Almayer think? Better ask him for the gun. A moonlight night. Look for deer. A colorable pretext. He would lie to Almayer. What did it matter? He lied to himself every minute of his life. And for what? For a woman. And such. Almayer's answer showed him that deception was useless. Everything gets to be known, even in this place. Well, he did not care. Cared for nothing but for the lost seconds. What if he should suddenly die? Die before he saw her. Before he could. As, with the sound of Almayer's laughter in his ears, he urged his canoe in a slanting course across the rapid current, he tried to tell himself that he could return at any moment. He would just go and look at the place where they used to meet, at the tree under which he lay when she took his hand, at the spot where she sat by his side. Just go there and then return, nothing more. But when his little skiff touched the bank, he leaped out, forgetting the painter, and the canoe hung for a moment amongst the bushes, and then swung out of sight before he had time to dash into the water and secure it. He was thunderstruck at first. Now he could not go back unless he called up the Raja's people to get a boat and rowers, and the way to Patalolo's kampong led past Aisa's house. He went up the path with the eager eyes and reluctant steps of a man pursuing a phantom, and when he found himself at a place where a narrow track branched off to the left towards Omar's clearing, he stood still, with a look of strained attention on his face, as if listening to a far-off voice, the voice of his fate. It was a sound inarticulate but full of meaning, and following it there came a rending and tearing within his breast. He twisted his fingers together, and the joints of his hands and arms cracked. On his forehead the perspiration stood out in small pearly drops. He looked round wildly. Above the shapeless darkness of the forest undergrowth rose the treetops with their high boughs and leaves standing out. Black on the pale sky like fragments of night floating on moonbeams. Under his feet warm steam rose from the heated earth. Round him there was a great silence. He was looking round for help. This silence, this immobility of his surroundings, seemed to him a cold rebuke, a stern refusal, a cruel unconcern. There was no safety outside of himself, and in himself there was no refuge. There was only the image of that woman. He had a sudden moment of lucidity, of that cruel lucidity that comes once in life to the most benighted. He seemed to see what went on within him, and was horrified at the strange sight. He, a white man whose worst fault till then had been a little want of judgment and too much confidence in the rectitude of his kind. That woman was a complete savage, and he tried to tell himself that the thing was of no consequence. It was a vain effort. The novelty of the sensations he had never experienced before in the slightest degree, yet had despised on hearsay from his safe position of a civilized man, destroyed his courage. He was disappointed with himself. He seemed to be. Surrendering to a wild creature the unstained purity of his life, of his race, of his civilization. He had a notion of being lost amongst shapeless things that were dangerous and ghastly. He struggled with a sense of certain defeat, lost his footing, fell back into the darkness. With a faint cry and an upward throw of his arms, he gave up as a tired swimmer gives up, because the swamped craft is gone from under his feet, because the night is dark and the shore is far, because death is better than strife. Part 2. The end. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey, the characters, and the world they carried with them. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Your support helps keep these stories alive and allows more timeless books to be shared with listeners around the world. Until next time, thank you for listening.